This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities, and I trust that in the interest of both the Cuban people and the Soviet technicians at the sites, the hazards to all concerned of continuing this threat will be recognized.
That was President John F. Kennedy on October 22, 1962, announcing a strict U.S. naval blockade of what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. This 13-day confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was sparked by the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles in Cuba. The president also raised America's military alert level for a possible nuclear war. Russia did the same. The world held its breath. It was, according to many historians, the closest that the world has come to nuclear annihilation. William LeoGrande is a professor at American University and a specialist in U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America. He joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Walk us through this. Take us back in history. How did this crisis even come about in the first place, and why did the Soviets put those missiles in Cuba?
Well, the Soviets had two objectives. One was to deter the United States from attacking Cuba because they saw Cuba as a beachhead of communism in Latin America. And of course, the United States had supported the Bay of Pigs invasion the year before in 1961, trying to overthrow Castro's government. The second objective was to try to close the missile gap. At that time, the United States had about 9 times the number of deliverable nuclear weapons as the Soviet Union did, and the Soviets had very few long-range weapons. So putting intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba was, in effect, a consolation for them, or a compensation for them, beginning to close that missile gap.
So can you describe and take us back to what the atmosphere was actually like 55 years ago?
Well, the Cold War was at a very high point. There had been the crisis in Berlin, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which damaged U.S. relations with Latin America and raised the tensions in the Cold War. Kennedy had met with Premier Khrushchev in Vienna, and that summit meeting had gone badly. So there was a sense that the Cold War was really reaching a kind of a peak.
You know, over that 13-day period, something small, as historians say, could have potentially triggered this war. How close did we come to a nuclear conflict?
Well, we came very close, and not so much because Kennedy or Khrushchev was intent on having one happen, but small mistakes. For example, we had a U-2 pilot flying over Cuba on reconnaissance at the missile sites shot down. And the result was that a lot of our military commanders wanted an immediate retaliatory strike. At the height of the crisis, an American U-2 plane overflew the Soviet Union. It got confused about its flight path, and the Soviets initially thought that might be the beginning of an American first strike. There was a Soviet military commander in a submarine who was contemplating whether he should attack American destroyers with nuclear torpedoes. So any one of those incidents might have triggered a wider war.
Who do you credit with walking us off the brink of nuclear war?
Well, I think President Kennedy made the right decision that he needed to leave Khrushchev a way to save face and get out of a corner. And so he was willing to trade our intermediate-range nuclear weapons in Turkey for the withdrawal of the weapons in Cuba. He wouldn't do it publicly for political reasons, but it gave Khrushchev an opportunity to tell his hardline military people that they had achieved the objective of deterring the United States from attacking Cuba and also getting U.S. missiles out of Turkey.
What do you think the lessons are that world leaders should take away from the Cuban Missile Crisis 55 years later?
I think the key lesson is that in a confrontation like this, where the danger of escalation is dramatic, you have to leave your adversary some way out of the corner. If your adversary is in a corner and the only choice is surrender or fight, the chances are he'll escalate.
William LeoGrande, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.